our next guest, my fingers crossed, he's joining us by phone. And if he's not already with us, I know he's very close to being here. But a National Sports Media Association Hall of Famer. I'm proud to say somebody that spoke at two of STAA's old one-day ticket to sportscasting success seminars we used to hold in conjunction with the NSMA. Thank you for being here. We're just going to launch straight in because I want to
Sure.
make up for the time. Now, we'll start with Todd Grassley. Todd, thank you for being here, and you have the first question for Bob Costas.
Hey, Bob, thanks for taking the time to join us. John, thanks for putting this together. Just had a question with the current situation we're in. What do you see trending in broadcasting as far as maybe athletes creating their own brands and their own channels during this time?
Well, that sort of personal branding and bypassing traditional media. The Players Tribune, Derek Jeter's project started that some years ago with social media, Instagram, and everything else. Players, athletes, a variety of people involved in sports have been doing that already. And now it's just going to be accelerated because even when tapping into traditional media, people are doing that in isolation. They're doing it by Skype or FaceTime or Zoom or whatever it may be. And if they want to keep current, then the only way to do it, since there aren't any games to speak of, and many of the traditional interview programs are either sidelined or compromised, you're going to find even more than what you recently had before the coronavirus pandemic hit. You're going to find even more of athletes and people involved in sports creating their own content and putting it out there through whatever means.
Thanks so much.
Next up, we'll go to Keith Joganatos. Thank you for being here, Keith. Please state your affiliation and your question for Bob.
Thank you, John. Mr. Costas, pleasure to talk to you today. I'm in Sacramento, California, Sacramento State. I work for the NFHS network, and NorCal Sports TV is a play-by-play man, and I might be doing play-by-play in the Coastal Plain League, depending on status of the virus and everything of that nature. My question to you today is that I noticed reviewing a lot of your play-by-play reels and your past work that you do a great job of setting up the play and then not so much talking over it as much, but letting the play speak for itself and then chiming in with your vocalics. How do you know when's the right time and wrong time, in your honest opinion, to set the play up and then let the play drag out and then come back in with your vocals?
Well, I think it's just a knack and a sense that you develop over time, a sense of rhythm and timing that's dependent upon a lot of things. For example, if it's the visiting team doing something extraordinary, you're going to have less atmospherics, generally speaking. You're going to have less crowd reaction. So the crowd reaction is part of it. What the other people involved in the broadcast, one or maybe two people in the booth with you, how recently have they spoken? They have to have a little bit of breathing room. You don't want to jump in right on top of them. My approach, baseball is different from other sports. Baseball has an entirely different rhythm and more of a storytelling thing. And you can have long counts where pitches are taken or fouled off, and that's when you get in background material, tell anecdotes, get into history, give and take with your partner. So baseball is in a separate category. But for example, when I did basketball, and most recently that would be Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls, and then just after that, Kobe and Shaq with the Lakers and their championship run. The way I looked at it was the job was to put a caption beneath the picture that already existed. Occasionally you would just call the play, but what I preferred to do, let's say Rick Smits, who then was the center for the Indiana Pacers, and they're going against Shaq and the Lakers. If Smits hit a basket early in the game, I might say something like, the Pacers have won every game in which he has scored 15 points or more, and they have lost every game in which he has scored 15 or less. Off to a good start here in Game 5. That, for a television broadcast, at least the way I approached it, was better than saying, Smith with an 18-footer, and it's good, the Pacers are up 8-6, because people can see that for themselves.
Let's go next to Sam Harrigan. Sam, thanks for hanging in. Your association or affiliation, and question for Bob Costas.
Hey, so right now I'm a senior at North Atlanta High School in Atlanta, but next year I'll be at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Bob, I just wanted to first thank you for taking the time to come speak to all of us. But from there, I want to ask, first off, what do you look for in someone you're working with in a booth, and who is the best color commentator you've ever worked with?
Well, I've worked with a number of them, and I can very honestly say that I enjoyed and respected virtually every one of them. I think that Doug Collins, whom I worked with on the NBA in the late 90s and early 2000s, I think really he was the best NBA analyst or color commentator ever. Not that there haven't been other good ones, but he was so keenly observant, but also had broadcasting skill so that he could get in and out of those small slots. He could make a point while the team was coming across the midcourt line before anything of consequence would happen, and get out before the play concluded. And then he could come back in. He just understood the rhythm of it perfectly. And then there were others I worked with, like Mr. Baseball Bob Uecker, who's still doing the Brewers games on the radio in his mid-80s. But back in the 90s, he was a gigantic television star nationally, apart from his baseball work. And he had such a great, dry sense of humor. And he and I were friends, so I knew how to set him up for some of his best anecdotes or lines. So it's different. People excel for different reasons. But one of the things I look for, to answer the first part of your question, in all of them, were they willing to be prepared? And since I was willing to be a good listener and give them space, I hope that they would return the favor and understand what my rhythm was. The play-by-play man's job is different, especially at the beginning of a baseball game. You're setting up the pitcher's background, his record, some of the past history, that kind of thing. I always felt like the first couple of innings belonged to the play-by-play man on balance, not exclusively, but on balance. Then the middle part of the game should lean more toward the color man or the analyst. And then you wanted an analyst who understood this. When the bases were loaded in the bottom of the ninth, or when the ball was being inbounded with 5 seconds to go and the team in possession is down by a point, the inventors of baseball and basketball didn't care that much about analysis. They cared about atmosphere and drama. So those moments should belong to the play-by-play man, whoever he or she is. And then after the moment has concluded, or during a timeout, that's when the analyst makes his observations, but not over those moments themselves. Those moments belong to the play-by-play guy.
Let's go next, and thank you for that question. Go next to Mr. Bonsu. Thank you for being here. You've been here a good portion of the day. I appreciate your hanging in. What's your affiliation and your question?
You guys can hear me?
Yep.
Hi, my name's Yao. I'm a senior at Bolden Senior High School in Bolden on Long Island. I'll be attending Syracuse University, Mr. Costas's alma mater, next fall, majoring in broadcast and digital journalism. I hosted a podcast at my school. I did sports writing for a few sites. I have my own website. That's my mini portfolio. So my question is, I'm only one of 402 people in here. Obviously, if I'm assuming correctly, we all have a dream or a goal to be on network television. But my question for you, Bob, is how do I separate myself from everybody else who have the same goal that I have? How do I put myself in a position where I'm on the preseason STAA list? How do I put myself into a position where I'm being considered for the Jim Nantz Award? And basically, how do I put myself above the ranks as one of the...
How does a young up-and-comer differentiate himself, Bob?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear that he's going to Syracuse, because we really have such a small list of successful sportscasters coming out of Syracuse. We need all the help we can get, so I'm glad to see that there's an emerging talent pool there. This advice is very general, because I'm not really as connected to the circumstances now as I was a long time ago. And obviously there are more and more avenues to produce content. In fact, he mentioned some of them. There are high school kids that have their own podcast, or they can have their own YouTube channel or Instagram content. So that's a way to get noticed. But I would say that this old school advice would still apply. Throw as much against the wall as you possibly can. Play the law of averages. whether it's by traditional mail or whether it's by email or you send it by Vimeo, however you do it, send your best work, your best resume reel, and that will always change because you'll get better over time when you're younger. Send the current best example of your work along with your resume and your goals and intentions. Send it to as many different places as possible. You're looking for summer work when the world returns to normal, between years in college, maybe summer league baseball or something like that. Don't apply to 1 or 2 places. Apply to 100. Apply to 100 minor league teams. Apply to every team in the D League, in the NBA. Apply to every small college when it comes to doing play-by-play. Someday you want to be on network television. You want to be in a big market. You want to be in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. But you got to be willing to start in Schenectady and Tuscaloosa. And so you send your resumes out there. And don't take it personally when you don't hear back or you get a polite rejection letter. It's not necessarily a reflection on you. You're playing a numbers game here. You throw 100 or 200 against the wall, 3 or 4 stick, and you're on your way. And each step along the way, as long as you're paying attention and truly getting better at it, each step along the way, you're putting additional lines on your resume that bulk that resume up and lead to better things, at least you hope.
Great advice. Thank you for that question. Let's now bring Josh Ayen to the plate. Josh, please state your affiliation and your question for Mr. Bob Costas.
Thanks, John. And hey, Bob, thanks again for joining us today. Big
Sure.
fan of your work. I'm a grad student over at IUPY in Indianapolis, working towards a master's in sports journalism. My question to you is about your work with interviewing subjects, in particular people that may or may be defensive or not willing to talk about topics as much. So my question is, how do you go about handling more difficult topics, especially in your role as a hosting or when interviewing people one-on-one when the topics may be a bit more controversial or difficult to talk about?
Well, preparation is always key. You have to know your stuff. You can't be locked into that preparation. You can't always follow question 3 with question 4 because you have to be a good listener and you have to be willing to respond and nimble enough to respond to the response. The response may prompt a follow-up or a different line of questioning. So that's part of it. There are people out there now who are just looking for sound bites. They're just looking for clickbait. They're just looking to be provocateurs. I think you can handle controversial questions in a responsible and journalistic way. There's no reason to be openly antagonistic, at least not at the start. You can present these topics politely if you know your stuff and if they're legitimate and pertinent questions, and then the person gets his or her backup because they don't want to hear it. Think presidential press conferences in the age of Trump. Perfectly good question, perfectly pertinent question, professionally posed, and he gets annoyed. Well, to a reasonable person, that's on him, not on the questioner. You can't be afraid to ask a reasonable question. You have to always be mindful of what the format is. If you've got 15, 20 minutes, like I used to have on HBO, that's different than having 5 minutes, like I might have had at halftime of an NBA game on NBC. So you have to prioritize the time and think of how much time you have to develop topics or ask follow-ups. But I don't think you should shy away from controversy if you handle it responsibly, and if the questions, the line of questioning are pertinent, then the other person should recognize that you're just doing your job. And in truth, I think this might be part of what you're asking here. People think that confrontational interviews or controversial topics are the toughest. For me, that was never the case. What's the toughest is when the interview subject is reticent. They're giving boring and monosyllabic answers, and it's tough to draw anything out of them. And then preparation comes into play even more. If you know a bit about their background, if you can ask them questions that are not the rote questions that they're used to answering on autopilot, then maybe you can get them to open up a little bit. But those are the ones that are the toughest. The ones that are just boring are much tougher than the ones that are confrontational.
You don't have to respond to this, Bob, because I want to get to the next question. But it's killing me. I can't think of the name of it. But when I was in college, you had a Sunday night nationally syndicated interview show from New York City. And that was the most fascinating, for a young aspiring sportscaster, the most fascinating interview show to listen to. Since the topic of interviews
that was
came
called,
up, I thought of you.
That was called Costas Coast to Coast, and the landscape was different then. It ran from the mid '80s to the mid '90s. All sports radio, which is now everywhere. It virtually didn't exist. WFAN in New York started in 1987. But prior to that, the idea of a 24/7 all sports radio station was unheard of. So 2 hours of sports talk with A-list guests like we had once a week, that was syndicated on more than 300 stations. And we weren't looking for sound bites or clickbait. We were looking for conversation that was entertaining, informative, and occasionally even substantive. A lot of it was lighthearted and humorous, but some of it was journalistic too. I think it had a good texture to it, and it's flattering that people still remember it all these years later.
Yeah, well, it's cool because until podcasting started to proliferate in recent years, there hadn't been a platform for long-form interviewing like you used to do on Coast to Coast, so it's neat to have that.
Yeah.
Marty,
Thanks.
Sakala. Oh, go ahead, Bob. Hang on, Marty. Go ahead, Bob.
No, that's it for me. Next question.
Okay. Marty Sakala, you're up, buddy. Please state your affiliation and your question for Bob.
Hi, John and Bob. I'm with the Brockport Golden Eagles. Just graduated from SUNY Brockport last December. Then I host a racing talk show on Rock Sports Network. And my question's kind of related to auto racing, Bob, because I believe, if I recall correctly, you were a part of the broadcasting team on NBC for the final NASCAR Cup race in 2017, and you got to interview Dale Earnhardt Jr. in his final race. I kind of would like to know as well what that experience was like doing NASCAR.
Well, it was a subject about which I had next to no expertise. And NBC, especially toward the end of my long run there, used to kind of use me in an emeritus role. And so they would bring me in and say, look, you don't have to be NASCAR expert. This is someone whose career and fame extends just hardcore fans. So you're the guy to ask them kind of the big picture question. So that was the one and only. That was the one and only NASCAR event I've ever attended. And I think you may have lost part of my answer here. Did that happen, John? Am I back on?
Only a tiny bit. We had everybody please keep your microphones muted so we don't have those kind of issues. But yeah, we only missed, I think, 3 or 4 seconds.
Oh, okay. So I was saying that I was not a NASCAR expert, did not pose as one. They wanted me sometimes to do kind of the big picture things for the iconic figures whose fame transcended the hardcore fans of that type of event. And it was under those circumstances that I interviewed Dale Jr., and he was extremely cordial and extremely appreciative. And I think we got to all the broad questions that had to be asked before that, which was his final event.
Appreciate it, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you, Marty. Let's go next to Anthony Pasquale. Anthony, thanks for hanging in. Please state your affiliation and your question.
Hey, John, thanks for having me and putting this all together. And hello, Bob. My name is Anthony. I'm from the University of Illinois. I'm a broadcaster for Big Ten Network Student U. And my question is, especially when you're broadcasting some of the biggest moments in sports, and the one that comes to mind as an Illinois guy, even though I wasn't alive then, was Jordan's final championship. You were the voice behind that. And when you have such iconic moments like that, how do you, how do you stay grounded and give the story to everybody when the story is so big?
Well, that particular moment is a good example. You had to have a sense of what this was. Any NBA final, any World Series or Super Bowl or Stanley Cup final is a big event within the history of that sport. But you'd have to be pretty narrow in your focus not to realize that Michael Jordan and those Chicago Bulls transcended all of that. That's why more than 2 decades later, the nation is focused on this Michael Jordan documentary. And they would have been even without everybody being in lockdown. If everything had been normal and it was running in June as they planned during what they thought was going to be the NBA Finals, it would still be the same for different reasons. People would still be fascinated. So coming into that final series against the Jazz, I knew, there was a very good chance that this was the last go-round. I didn't know they were calling it the last dance. That was between Phil Jackson and his team. But there was a very good chance that this was Michael Jordan's swan song with the Bulls. And therefore, there goes the dynasty. So I knew that. Now, the game itself comes down to the final moments. Until the very end, there was a very good chance that the Jazz would force a Game 7, and that Game 7 would be on their floor, and Scottie Pippen was hobbling around with a bad back. It was by no means assured that the Bulls would win that series. But you had to have the bigger picture in the back of your mind. Not just that game, as dramatic as and important as it was, but Michael Jordan's career and this whole 90s Bulls dynasty, which captivated the entire country. So if you watch that back, and it's been a while since I have, but I understand that it's going to be part of the last of the 10 episodes of this Bulls documentary on ESPN, I called the play, and then Doug Collins and Isaiah Thomas rightly came in and analyzed the play. Jordan's steal, sneaking up on Karl Malone from behind, and then the move he made on Brian Russell to bury the jump shot. But when they were done, I said something to the effect, who knows what will unfold in the next several months, but that may have been the last shot Michael Jordan will ever take in the NBA. And it was so classic and so perfect, I then said, as luckily they ran a slow motion replay, if that's the last image of Michael Jordan, how magnificent is it? And then Doug Collins said, I don't think you could describe it, or words to that effect. And at that point, they're back on the huddle during the timeout because the Jazz had one more shot. And I said, well, if this is the last chapter, what a way to close the book. And I think if I was just tunnel visioned into nuts and bolts play-by-play, I wouldn't have been able to say those things. And those things hold up 22 years later. So having that broad view of what's going on, if it was Brady, Belichick, and the Patriots, if they had made the Super Bowl this past year, which they didn't, and if there was a sense that this was the end, then whoever's calling that game has to have that in mind, as well as just what's going on in the game itself.
Hey, Bob, we have in 10 minutes, Kevin Kugler will be joining us. Your time was supposed to be up right now, but because I butchered the instructions for you to join us, might you stay for 8 more minutes?
Of course.
Oh, you're the
Of
best.
course.
Thank you. Thank you for covering for my mistake. I appreciate that. Let's go to Dylan Pescator. Dylan, thank you for being here, man. I appreciate it. Go ahead and state your affiliation and your question for Bob.
Thank you, John. I'm a high school student going to Arizona State University next year. Bob, thank you so much for doing this. It's amazing to hear from you. And I actually have somewhat of a specific question that can go into a realm of different things. But a game that stood out to me was Game 1 of the Yankees and Twins ALDS from this past year. And the first home run, I believe in the first inning by Jorge Polanco, you called it off the screws, and you were somewhat referencing to the juice balls. So how do you think that came to mind, and how you can really go away from just back, gone to a call like that?
Well, I think that call was simultaneously good and bad. You make mistakes sometimes. You don't like to make them. You hope that they are few and far between. But with the naked eye, I thought he had actually hit that off the fists. So it wasn't clear to me that it was a legit home run, a line drive home run into the lower left field stands. Once it went out, I recovered and said, no, I was wrong. He got all of it. But it was also relevant because tying into what we were saying before, although it's not nearly as epic, it wasn't the World Series, it was the beginning of the playoffs, the division series, but the big picture story in baseball is that several teams went past the previous all-time team record for homers in a season. A record number of homers were hit all around baseball. And everyone agreed, they might have disagreed as to the reasons, but everyone agreed, including the commissioner's office, that the ball was acting differently than it had in the past, and baseballs were flying out of ballparks at a record rate. Plus, at Yankee Stadium, not so much to left field where that home run went, but to right field, the dimensions are very hitter-friendly, and that night, the wind was blowing out toward right field, and later in the game, two right-handed hitters hit opposite field home runs that barely got over that right field fence. So the dimensions at Yankee Stadium, the lively ball, and the wind all played into it. The Twins held the record. They had 307 home runs that year. The Yankees hit 306. So that was part of the storyline of the game. And lo and behold, the second batter of the game fed into that storyline. Not to mention the fact that James Paxton, very good starter for the Yankees, had led the major leagues in a dubious category, first inning home runs allowed. So that had been a factor for him, a negative factor all year long. So he had framed all of those things, and on the second batter, it played into that story. So I was happy with the fact that we got that part of the narrative right, but I was unhappy with the fact that in the immediate moment, I wasn't aware that he had hit it as well as he had. That was a bad call for me. And I acknowledged it. I didn't try to fudge it. I acknowledged it. When they put the replay on, I said, with the naked eye, I thought he hit it off the fist. I was wrong. He got every bit of it.
Thank you, Bob.
Last, well, maybe last, it depends. There might be time for two more, but let's go to Kai Dambach. Kai, all the way from Germany.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it, Kai.
Yeah, no problem. It's a couple minutes before midnight. So I just want to say for everybody, my name is Kai Dambach, and I am a Bundesliga soccer announcer for Deutsche Welle, and I also do the Bonn Capitals baseball team here. I just have to ask Mr. Costas. As you might be able to tell, I have international experience, but I'm considering coming back to the U.S. How can I bring my international experience to an American market?
Well, if you look around American TV, American sports TV, there's more and more international coverage, partly because in addition to the flagship NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, they all have their own cable sports networks. And those cable networks carry Premier League, they carry World Cup stuff, they carry Olympic-style events. So that can actually be a good niche for an American broadcaster because not as many of us are adept at calling those events. There just aren't as many people who are good at calling a soccer game, at least in the States, as there are who are good at calling a football game or a basketball game. So if you bring those skills to the table, they may not be the only skills you have. You may be able to do some of the more previously mainstream sports as well, mainstream for an American audience. But if you can do some of these niche sports well, that could be your calling card at the start. So I would say it's an asset rather than a drawback.
Thank you for the question, Kai. I always appreciate you participating in our Zoom events. Let's go next. This will be the last question for Bob. I had his mic unmuted a half a moment ago. Aiden Blanc, go ahead. I think you're good. What's your question for Bob and your affiliation first?
Hi, guys. I'm Aiden. I'm a high school student in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm a junior. I did some work with ESPN last year doing the Little League World Series on Kids Cast on ESPN2. Bob, how do you work in with a new analyst? I know when we did our game at the World Series, we worked with Monet Davis, who had been there before. How do you break in a new, for lack of a better term, break in a new analyst and kind of get to know them and work with them? And at the same time, the same thing for a producer or any other member that you would work with on a broadcast.
Well, you hope you start out with mutual respect and the understanding you're going to have to feel each other's rhythm out. And so I think at the start, you tend to give each other more room than you actually need because you don't want to step on each other. And whoever is the senior partner, whoever's been doing it longer, the other one tends to defer to him or her. And then eventually you just kind of get into the rhythm. I think the key is respect. If my partner does well, then I do well. I want the whole broadcast to sound and look good. And if it does, it reflects well on all of us. It's not a game of one-upsmanship. You have to recognize the differences in the roles and the times when, as I mentioned before, it's appropriate for the play-by-play man to take the lead and the times when it's appropriate for the analyst to take the lead. But in the overall, you want each to excel. And what a producer has to be mindful of is that while he or she wants to put their mark on the broadcast, and there are more and more bells and whistles available now than ever before, replay angles, graphics, special effects, if a game is overproduced, it becomes uncomfortable for the viewer, and it's harder for the broadcasters to stay in sync and to get into a rhythm of their own. Same thing with the director. The good directors and broadcasters are in sync with each other. If the broadcaster is talking about the quarterback, the director does not take a shot of the coach unless there's a compelling reason to do it. He's got to be listening to the broadcaster. On the other hand, if the director and producer have put up some great visuals and the broadcaster is intent on telling his story no matter what, well, then he's screwing up that relationship as well. The two have to be in sync. It's almost like a symphony. And if you can get it going right, director, producer, camera people, broadcasters, if you can all get in sync and do your parts and hit your respective notes at the right time, then you've got a beautiful harmony going. When it doesn't work, it's discordant and the audience knows it.
Sounds like the instructions I gave you that threw us off at the start of this segment, Bob. We weren't in harmony. It was my fault. I apologize. But
we forgive you
so much. Oh, I was going to say,
you're welcome. I enjoyed it. I'm sorry for being late, but I enjoyed it.
Well, it wasn't your fault that you were late, but I'm grateful for your participation. Thank you so much for that. And as much of a thrill as it was for my wife to meet you and your wife in the elevator in Salisbury in SMA a few years ago, it was a bigger thrill for her 45 minutes ago to talk to you on the phone to help get this all worked out. So thank you so much, Bob. You are appreciated.
John, thank you, and thank Amy for her help as well, and thanks to the 400 plus for being part of this.